Hey everybody. Sorry, this is just now getting recorded and posted for you. I hope everybody stayed home and was safe and ready to go today, especially considering the early timing of our class and the fact that so many of you are upperclassmen who likely live off campus. So hopefully you guys all stayed safe and warm, and even if you have class later today, it's a little bit easier for you to get around than it was this morning. So I am recording this a little bit late, not because I was late getting in, but because I ended up having some emergencies in international affairs that I decided to prioritize over getting this recorded. But we're going to jump in here. I don't perceive this lasting a full hour and a half like class time would, but don't let that mean for you that you are getting shortcutted on information. I plan to sort of dedicate some time on Friday to going back over this. If you have additional questions, and then also feel free to email me. My email address is newlon.7, Newlon.7, and I am happy to answer questions as we go along. Also, there's kind of a funny video at the beginning of this that I'm going to kind of skip through for the sake of length of recording, but I will also post the PowerPoint itself into the notes so that you have a chance to, it's already posted now even, so that you can watch that on your own, but I won't do it for the sake of making this recording so long and being a massive file for you to have to open up. So on we go to the actual lecture. So this is one of my favorite because it's all about communication and those types of things. So it's a couple of different kind of funny communication type pieces that were out there. This is one of my favorite little things on Pinterest. So if you guys, you probably don't know, but this is Avogadro's, and Avogadro's number is this number here, which has some mathematical significance. So I thought it was kind of a funny means of communication. And hey, ladies, take my number, I'm Avogadro's. So that one, and then also in the season of promposals and that sort of thing, this picture over here, it's actually one of my nieces, but she and the guy who she went to prom with a couple years ago, they were also on the parliamentary procedure team together. So it says, Allie, I move that we go to prom, ? And then it says, underneath it, it then says, is there a second? So for those of you who use parliamentary procedure, really kind of the purpose of parliamentary procedure is actually about communication and ensuring that in terms of power balance, communicating what is expected, those types of things. It's kind of like having manners, going into a situation, if you know what's expected of you and you know what is sort of protocol, it kind of relieves some of the tension, and also it doesn't make decisions quite as subjective. It helps make things sort of more objective moving forward. So I consider parliamentary procedure a form of communication with that. So before we jump in with the rest of the communication lecture, though, I want to remind you guys that you should be doing all you can to make sure that you are feeling first class, I guess I should say world class rather than middle class. And don't forget that your thinking, which would be hopefully being world class, affects your behaviors, and that affects your results. So we always have to come back to that. So quote to ponder for today: those who are lifting the world upward and onward are those who encourage more than criticize. So onward and upward, and Elizabeth Harrison is the one who said that. Okay, so where have we been? We've talked through the characteristics of teams and also then the process of teamwork. And today is the last lecture sort of in the process section of what we're going through. So this lecture, it has some interesting bits and pieces to it, I think, just because it kind of challenges me in some ways with some of the information, and we'll get to that. But by the end of today, you should be able to describe characteristics of the communication process, identify elements that strengthen and weaken individual and team communication, and then identify the role, not off, but of emotional intelligence in your role as a leader. Actually, what we're going to do is I've actually separated this out, and the emotional intelligence lecture is going to be Friday. So a little bit different in terms of that. So here we go. So this is the video I was going to show. It just kind of has some interesting snips from TV and that sort of thing about communication fails. So we're skipping. All right. So communication within teams, and the communication process is something that as a leader you're going to have to address in a number of different ways. So in the ways that sort of you look at communication, there is the sender, there's the receiver, and then there's the actual message. These are sort of the foundations. And if there's been something miscommunicated, it kind of gives you a guide to come back through and diagnose where was there an issue. In that miscommunication, for instance. And in terms of crafting your message, you also need to recognize sender, receiver, and message. So, and for instance, if you are Myers-Briggs ENFP, like me, and I'm the sender, I might sort of ask for something or give somebody a message in a way that is slightly enthusiastic or positive, whereas the receiver, if they are, for instance, maybe ISTJ, and they're like, they give no credibility to that, maybe because I am not like them and they are reading into my message something not intended, because that's not their style. So then the message gets jumbled because they are associating some different types of personality traits, like they're using like as a receiver. So whose fault is that? It's partially mine because I didn't temper what I said, considering who the receiver was going to be. It's partially on behalf of the receiver because they didn't temper who they are in terms of receiving the message. But then, could the message have been crafted better in general? Or depending on what the message is, should it have been crafted a little differently and with more sort of attention to detail given the differences in sender and receiver? So this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky for me because we start to talk about this concept that's going to come up about attractiveness. And it's not meant to be like, are you attractive? Like, could you be a bachelorette on The Bachelor or something along those lines? It's more about who you are in relation in the eyes of the person you're speaking to, and do they relate to you in terms of respecting you and seeing you as somebody in power. So, but as a sender, your credibility, your perceived expertise is very important for a lot of you in the class who are maybe traditional college-age students. As you enter the working world, you're going to potentially need to do a lot in order to earn both expertise and trustworthiness because you don't have a long track record quite yet in the professional field. So the value and credibility of the sender, you need to remember, is determined by the receiver. This is also where the generational information and characteristics start to come in. So you want to know what people think of millennials, and I know that you all know that it's mixed reviews, but I don't necessarily buy into all of that. But there may be some assumptions on behalf of the people receiving your message based on that you need to overcome in different ways. But you can also leverage different things about yourself in terms of your credibility by not necessarily going out and automatically being like, I have a degree in this, things like that, but by saying, by letting people know that you are intelligent, well-studied, making sure that you've crafted your messages well, that you're not speaking out of turn, you're not filling in the gaps with information you may or may not know or is true, that sort of thing. So as a sender, you need to keep that in mind. And then when you're a receiver, also keep that in mind about your sender when you're talking to someone else. So it goes both ways because there'll be situations where you're the sender and the receiver. So consider that. So what do we mean by expertise? What do team leaders need? Expertise within. So if you are managing a team of people and you need to help them gain some expertise for the sake of their credibility, you need to ask yourself that question and try to fill in any gaps that might be there. And then also, what was the impact of the level of expertise of team members and their level of involvement and team problem solving and goal setting? So what actually was the impact of their level, and is that another reason then for you to help ensure that your team is well trained and has the expertise that they need in order to address problems and communicate well? So this is where we really dig into the attractiveness. So as a sender, the receiver is going to look at you in terms of attractiveness. So there is this physical appearance. It's not necessarily talking about, are you ugly or pretty? But do you have yourself pulled together? Are you representing yourself in a way in which your physicality represents your brand and who you want people to associate you with? So, for instance, if you were to come to class in, like for instance, to present during the workshop in running shorts, I would probably maybe question sort of your physical appearance in terms of dressing appropriately for that type of specific scenario and situation. So this gets really interesting. Some people really like to dig into this and dwell on it. But I would just say in general, just, good hygiene, appropriate dress for the situation that you're coming into. And that kind of are the important components of physical appearance. So we're going to jump into a little bit more of that with this next bullet point, which more attractive to a group. The sender is if they are similar in terms of appearance, background, attitudes, and lifestyle. So this thing starts to get into some issues of bias that people have sometimes. And so these bullet points aren't necessarily saying that this is right. They're saying that in terms of the research, this is what we find in terms of who people interact with or who they receive messages from. Because they can relate to you in some ways, or because there's a perceived relationship to that person because of similarity, the message is typically easier heard in that. So right or wrong, mainly wrong, but that's the way that sort of statistically speaking, people can relate to. But at the same time, even though it's not necessarily right, it explains a lot of different things. And so sometimes you can counteract some of this by being extremely attentive, for instance, to developing rapport with the group that you're going to be sending a message to. And gaining that trust. So we've talked about that baseline trust, and how do you gain it? By building cohesion, by them understanding who you are and getting to know you as a person. Some exercise that I've done before that might be useful in a group as well to kind of explain this is I did an exercise where everybody in the room was just given a potato from a bag, or different groups within the room were given a potato from a bag. So, and then they immediately put it back into the middle of the room, and everyone then had to go up and get their potato out of the pile. Nobody could identify their potato. So it was a mess. But then the groups took the potatoes back, they just kind of took a random potato then, and they made up this entire story about the potato. They paid attention then to it got this scar or it got this bump, because they got to know their potato. They gave the potato a story. And then when they put the potatoes back in the middle and came back to get them again after they've been all put in the pile, nobody had any issue at all getting their potato. So just to kind of take out the human side of things, that kind of is a good exercise that you might use to teach a group about recognizing just the impact of knowing who people are versus just looking at the exterior kind of without really getting to know even a potato. So, and then the next thing in terms of attractiveness, high status people, there's an assumption within society, of course, that if you have a high title or certain certifications or degrees, for instance, that you have earned that in some way, which again, we could have a long discussion about the social justice related to that. And do people who, for instance, have a PhD really know more than people who have a bachelor's degree? Yes, but from a very specific slice or angle or perspective of a certain situation. So, but at the same time, these are all important things to understand in terms of understanding communication process and how people give authority, for instance, to senders of various messages. And then, is it somebody who others want to be like? Is it somebody who is, for instance, like a pop star or something? That can be something that gives people that makes people sort of attractive in terms of somebody who sends a message. So when you start talking about people who are spokespeople for different things, or the poster child for a certain situation, oftentimes it's going to be like people who are in popular culture, because there's a sense that the receiver of the message wants to be like the person who was chosen to be the spokesperson. So that's why that is the way it is. Okay, and so then which is more important, credibility or attractiveness? It depends on the issue being examined. So if you're talking, for instance, about whether or not to, I don't know, how to fix the fact that electricity went out, I don't care how attractive or similar to me somebody is. I just want somebody who has the skills and credibility to actually reattach electricity and make it happen. But if it's something lighter and something that's more of like a social type situation, attractiveness might end up becoming more important in those situations. So if you want to dwell on this a little bit longer and think about it and reflect upon it, hit pause and then come on back when you're ready to move on. All right, we're going to dig into this a little bit more. So this is then, like, if you have then had a chance to reflect on it, this is then what we kind of hope you came to with it. If the issue is about objective facts, credibility, like obviously, like objectively, how do you turn power back on? Versus attractive, the issue is about subjective values or preferences, i.e. social issues. So that is sort of how that came about. Okay, so then now we're going to move to the other side of things and talk about the receiver or the audience of a message. For those to be sort of well understood, there's some things you need to think about there. So personality characteristics of the receiver. So if you, for instance, are the speaker speaking to an audience, the intelligence and language skills influence the wording. So you need to think about the receiver of your message and their personality, their intelligence and language skills. Also, credible communicators more easily convince those with low self-esteem. So when you think about, like, if you're the speaker and that's your audience, and you're talking to people who have low self-esteem, for instance, they're going to be super easy to convince of the argument you're trying to put forward because they are easily influenced. So as a receiver, keep that in mind. Work on your self-esteem. Don't be prone to some of these different things. Also, jargon and miscommunication. Keep that in mind. If you use too much jargon, the receiver and audience could very easily get confused about things. Just to kind of give you a quick example, in the Office of International Affairs and Study Abroad, there's one employee in particular who deals a lot with risk management and uses a lot of jargon. Like he loves it. I think whether it's acronyms, shortened names for different companies, for instance, that do different things, constantly throwing them out. And I mean, I'm getting a PhD and I've worked in this field for 11 years and I still have to be like, what was that? Or like I pick up my phone and like, what does that mean? Or just have to stop them and say like, what are you talking about? Or have to just kind of sit and listen for context clues to figure out what was he talking about. So pay attention to that, and because if your audience doesn't share that jargon, it's going to end up being miscommunicated in a lot of ways, because there's still maybe back, a paragraph if you had the written communication with them in terms of trying to figure out what you were talking about and being distracted by that as well. And then the relationship to the message that's being conveyed. This, for instance, if you are, let's say, the coach of a sports team and you come in and you start talking about, I don't know, like let's say parents are in the background and you start talking directly to the parents and saying like, you need to make sure your kids have these things filled out and ready to go. And the kids are between you and the parents and the message wasn't for them. Then the kids start to tune out, but they're between you and the parents. And then that gets that muddles the communication, for instance. So All right. So communication processes vary based on the level of agreement and disagreement with the message. So if, for instance, you are politically speaking, you're presenting a conservative message to a liberal audience, they're not going to hear it well because they're not necessarily going to be listening to hear, but listening to respond, for instance. So you need to make sure you smooth out that message and talk through it a little bit. And then highly credible sources may be more effective in advocating unpopular positions. So yeah, so the higher level of credibility somebody has, the more people sort of accept what they say, even if it's not what they had initially agreed with, or even continue to agree with. They sort of accept it, but maybe then in their mind, there's also thinking about how they can rationalize that information in order to add it into their way of knowing about that specific situation. So just to kind of reiterate, when you're thinking about your audience and conveying a message, keep in mind personality characteristics, including their intelligence and the level of language you use, and not making it to be, too high. I think they still say a lot of newspapers in the world are written at a 3rd grade level. I was even encouraged in terms of my dissertation to write it at an 8th grade level. So I was told I was being too jargony and using too high level of the language, even in my dissertation, because it needs to be able to be read by the masses, not just my advisors. Pay attention to jargon and communication so as not to confuse people and leave them behind in the conversation. And then also consider the people's relationship to the message and whether it's something that is going to challenge them or that is an unpopular position, and how you can counteract that. So, and now the message. So we've talked about the sender and the receiver, and now the message. So messages need to vary in sophistication, emotion, and aesthetics in terms of being pleasing. So for instance, there are times when I'll turn on the Appalachian Charm with certain audiences because I need to down the sophistication a little bit in order to relate to different people. But then there are times when I'm talking, for instance, to the dean of the college where I am pulling out as much articulate verbiage as I can in order to try to impress her. So that is going to vary, and you need to consider who you're talking to. Avoid jargon and one-sided messages that ignore the existence of alternative positions. You always want to say, for instance, I recognize that this is not, the opinion of everybody in the room, but I ask you to, hear me out, for instance, is something that would often be said. You don't want to just completely ignore it because that's not a good way to be. Rational arguments are better with an educated audience. You don't always, trying to rationalize something doesn't always work unless everybody in the room is well versed and understands what you're talking about. So, for instance, talking with people about, for instance, mental health issues, if you're trying to provide a rationale for different things, unless they are educated, for instance, in the intricacies of mental health, rationalizing and trying to explain things to people, it doesn't work. So not even just like an educated audience, but educated about that specific topic. Okay, and then emotion and fear arousing messages are persuasive. However, this could lose effectiveness with some audiences who attempt to block or manage their emotional impact. So one of the things that they teach people fairly often, for instance, environment and natural resources, if you say, if we do this, 50% of people will die. That actually carries a very different message than if we do this, we can save 50% of the people, right? And maybe I shouldn't even use people in this, but like let's say trees. All right, so if we do this thing, like 50% of the trees are still going to die, versus if we do this, 50% of the trees are going to live. And that carries a very different message. You can even do it with different percentages, such as, if we carry out this procedure in order to intersect with this problem, it could potentially kill 20% of the trees in this forest. versus our estimation is if we do this intervention, we can save 80% of trees in the forest. It's a very different receiver, or a different way it's received in terms of that message in that way. So keep that in mind, and be very intentional in the way you craft your messages in order to not sort of evoke too much emotion so that you cut people off, and realize that especially when using percentages, for instance, using the positive side of it, it tends to elicit more sort of positive emotion in terms of whatever you're presenting. All right. So then within your team, ascenders are often poor at perception taking. They assume the receivers have more information than they actually do. So for instance, if you have a department chair presenting about something in a meeting, or somebody who's in charge of a specific project, it happens a lot to me with student organizations. They'll start presenting and talk about an event that they assume everybody in the organization knows about from a historical perspective, but there are new people in the room who've never even heard of this event. And, you know, I, as an advisor, kind of have to say, like, well, like, let's take a step back. Can you explain to everybody what this event is before we jump into asking people to volunteer for it? You know, and I have, you know, friends growing up in high school who come in and be like, well, you know, like, Jenny, like, you know, like from like my mom's cousin sort of a thing. And I'm like, no, I don't know Jenny, your mom's cousin, but I'm not going to stop you because I don't want to prolong this conversation. So just kind of keep that in mind and try to avoid doing that yourself. Members are biased toward presenting positively distorted messages. This happens all the time. Like, so for instance, if somebody made a mistake and something got screwed up, they will oftentimes try to downplay the negative impact they had, to not lose face and to try to maintain some credibility. So, you know, keep that in mind in terms of working with people on the team as well. You may not be hearing the full story. And then at the same time, if they're presenting to a group, oftentimes people will err on the side of positivity than negativity, especially if it outs them in some way. There's oftentimes a lack of full explanations. They believe the reason behind their statements are obvious. They think that everybody knows what is going on behind the scenes, or that they can make the leap knowing basic context type situation, and that's not always true. So making sure that your messages go into explanation and or leaving yourself open for questions, or keeping an eye on people and be perspective taking, so that you can notice when people are getting confused and try to fill in some of those gaps, or stop and take questions where you are at that moment so that people aren't moving on confused and you're leaving them behind. And then challenges of our assumptions. We actually, as people, make a lot of assumptions. It's sort of a natural thing that we do. If there's a gap in information, we fill that gap. So make sure that you're challenging your own assumptions, whether that be about people in the group. I think you'll also find out that, especially when we talk about the dysfunctions of a team, for instance, if you see a high level of, for instance, rule following or application of rules, a very detailed constitution and rules, for instance, that actually indicates an assumption of a lack of trust. So that's just one example. But when you are working within teams and communication, always challenge yourself to say, did I think this because I'm assuming it, or do I know this to be true? And it may take some extra work and some maturity and experience within leadership type roles to start to figure out whether or not things are assumptions or reality. Okay, so the climates in which you are communicating within are definite of importance. And we're jumping into, if you can see up here, the flow of a team's communication. And it kind of gets divided up into whether there's a supportive or negative climate for communication climates. What is a supportive climate? It's open, inclusive, and rewarding. People say, oh, good point. Those types of things, for instance. The messages are facts and opinions versus negative evaluations and criticisms. So if there is an issue, rather than saying you screwed up or you're a bad person because you screwed up, which would be a negative evaluation or criticism, we say, there seems to have been a communication gap or a mistake made. Let's try to keep judgment out of this for now. Or if there is an opinion put out there that said, based on what I know, this is what I think. And really addressing it in your own mind, knowing that this is an opinion versus a fact. And then focus on problem solving and discussion versus controlling team communication and trying to decide who is the winner. So when there is a conflict, a supportive climate would address things sort of in a very problem solving, let's identify the facts, let's thread out what is an opinion and come up with problem solving and not let anybody sort of be like, I'm the winner. And a negative climate, what you're going to see, defensive behaviors. People say, well, it wasn't me. That lack of accountability, dysfunctions of a team. This is really coming out in this piece, isn't it, guys? And then competitive behaviors contribute to a negative climate. So from the lecture on Friday, are you competing or are you cooperating? And then closed, alienating, blaming, discouraging, punishing type behaviors that come out from other members or leadership. So if people are being blamed or alienated, that's going to make people even more defensive in terms of their behavior because they don't want to be the person who's being alienated, punished, those types of things. So keep things as supportive as you possibly can in the environment and the way you set up your team and your organizations so that people have this positive atmosphere rather than being competitive and defensive. All right, so a quote to ponder as we go through this then. You know what, guys? There we go. Those who are uplifting, blah, blah, blah. Follow-up, send a receiver. Okay, so for whatever reason, I'm sorry, those slides are in there twice. So we're going to keep moving through here. So in terms of flow of a team's communication, we're back on track now. Open, inclusive, and rewarding. Messages are facts versus opinions. But then also moving on to psychological safety, processing information within the team, and building trust. So what is psychological safety? It's an environment where people feel free to express their thoughts and feelings. There's interpersonal trust and mutual respect. Important when giving feedback, for instance, people need to feel psychologically safe in that situation. So if you are a supervisor giving somebody feedback or a peer giving somebody feedback, if they don't feel psychologically safe, they're automatically going to be defensive or not accept what you have to say. And then also keep in mind that leaders promote safety within organizations. So psychological safety has a lot to do within that communication climate. All right. So in terms of them processing that within a team and the issues that can potentially come up that lead to those types of things, there can be a failure to combine unique knowledge of people within your team. So, you aren't calling upon each other's strengths and covering for each other's weaknesses like you guys defined as part of your workshop teams in class. Biases hinder decision-making. People have biases against other people. People have biases against certain processes as you move forward as well. And how do you solve it? The leader should focus the team's attention. Like, let's not talk about that. They're like, let's not get derailed and go off on the sidetrack. We're going to focus on solving this one problem. Again, problem-solving approach. So focusing on a problem-solving approach. List some of the different alternatives and analyze those. And then work on building trust. And we talked about that in terms of cohesiveness as well when we talked through that. So how do you build a team's trust? It's based on social relationships, which is why we have those exercises, especially within your smaller teams. of getting to know each other, your hometown, those types of things, if you remember those exercises. People make investments in developing and maintaining relationships, and ties among people encourage cooperation and trust when you have these social relationships built. At the beginning of a social encounter, people take a chance on trusting each other while observing how the other person responds. So this goes back to the prisoner's dilemma exercise, where when people, by nature, when you first encounter each other, you were looking to see, when that person laid that first card, was I able to trust them to do what would have been the best thing for both of us? Or were they out to serve themselves alone? So that first social encounter, or the beginning of it, is when people start to decide whether or not they can trust each other. The experience of future trust is determined by what happens in that relationship. So as things develop, are you setting things up so that you engender trust into the future? Trust is built over time through social interactions. So that's very important for teams and organizations, is to ensure that you can have social interactions on a regular basis so that you continue to build the trust in your team, because it can disintegrate and sort of weaken without those types of maintenance type activities. And if you want your team to work together in terms of teamwork, having those social functions is really going to be important in order to make that happen. And it doesn't have to be like everybody goes out to happy hour together, those types of things. It can be things within work that help do that. So, just little like Valentine's Day decorations, or a little exercise in the office where people post things about themselves, or just little fun things that don't take up time necessarily, but still help people get to know each other. So moving on then, in terms of different quotes from the book and other resources out there, on page 107, trust is the expression of confidence in team relationships. That is confidence one has that other team members will honor their commitment. So again, trust building on commitment. We've learned about this, guys. All right, so for team members to trust, they must believe the team is competent to complete its task, and the team environment is safe for all members. So that, going back again to whether or not people have the credibility and the skills needed in order to trust each other. Trust and individual behavior viewed at the team level could have variability within a group. So keep in mind that different people within your group may trust each other to varying degrees. So one person might trust somebody, but maybe somebody else had a different experience with that person and is lacking trust. And that could lead to communication gaps, as well as issues within the team in terms of what people feel is appropriate and allowable. So a lack of trust can be between members or leader members based on social relationships. Again, keep in mind that there can be a disconnect in terms of trust among everybody in the team, regardless of their role within the team. So there's a difference, though, keeping in mind that there's a difference between being trusting and being trustworthy. If you're trusting, you're willing to leave yourself open with information and sharing with others by providing help and resources. So you are trusting them, and so therefore you are being open. You're sharing the information you have access to, rather than holding it for yourself in terms of keeping the power. Being trustworthy means accepting the contributions that other group members, supporting their actions, accepting the contributions of other group members, like when they are opening themselves up and being trusting of you with their information. And then supporting their actions and cooperating and assisting them. So you're using the information in a positive way in order to support and cooperate with those people. So, but a lot of times you have to be sort of vulnerable and be that person who is trusting and willing to give up some information in order then to be trustworthy and be worthy of somebody else's trust in you. All right, so that is the lecture for the day, guys. So hopefully it wasn't too terribly boring for you. And again, if you have questions, reach out to me. On Friday, we're going to jump into emotional intelligence, how that's important in terms of like perception reading and trusting people and being trustworthy, for instance. And that's why those go so well together. So we also, your next assignment isn't due until Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. and it is a second scenario analysis. And I am coming up with that scenario analysis for you all. I'm not finding one I like that's already prepackaged online. So I am going to probably be writing one out for you, or recording something in order for you guys to respond to that. And it'll probably be something that all of you can relate to, so potentially being a student, for instance. All right, so stay safe, stay warm, and I will see you Friday.